All right, so foraging and AKA hunting and gathering, fishing, scavenging, these would all go under foraging. It's the oldest form of tending to our basic needs, AKA food. Um, it's a tactic that our primate relatives have used. However, the practice is definitely endangered. And again, it has a lot to do with land ownership and what we do with that land. The tools that were used um, were again not super sophisticated in terms of what we think of as modern tools. Again, when I say sophistication, I don't necessarily mean some judgy way. I'm thinking as function, right? We have a little tool. We have tools for every little thing that we do. Um, a lot of people use sticks to dig for tubers, stone tools for certain things like hunting, um, bone hooks or harpoons for fishing. Again, and actually, I take the word sophisticated back. When you look at some of these things, they are very sophisticated in terms of the craftsmanship. Um, I guess it's not metal. We're not moving into smelting metal, and we're not using division of labor. Anybody could kind of make these tools if they were taught how to do it. Um, Now, one thing about foraging that we need to know that as a class moving forward is that it is considered an extensive strategy, which means large land areas are required and access to movement. So what that means is prior to agriculture, we needed vast areas of land, miles and miles of land to forage for acorns. Um, so this is vitally important to understand the difference between extensive and intensive. Now, what we're going to start to get into is a little bit of the diet and health of individuals in this strategy. One of the things that is interesting about foraging cultures is that they tend to be in a lot better shape than we are, and this works to the extensive strategy idea. If I have to walk miles and miles to collect acorns in a day, I am getting all the exercise that I need. Now, if I am hunched over and picking a crop and it's only, you know, a couple hundred yards by a couple hundred yards, we're not actually getting our physical labor in terms of getting our heart rates up to deal with that. The other thing is in terms of what we eat is very different, and we'll talk about those. In this foraging strategy, hunting, gathering, there's not much division of labor. Gender and age tend to be to gather, or if you're younger or older, they tended to gather smaller things, not as big things that you have to carry, right? The key piece here is that there is no status division in terms of hunting or gathering. In these groups, if the group needed meat and the men were busy, women would go hunt. If it was blueberry or blackberry harvest, everybody's harvesting. It was not women's work. It's not until we get into like chiefdoms and some of these other discernible political economies that we start to move into division of labor by gender. Foraging is not going to have that. The idea that men tend to be the universal hunters, this is not a universal. Again, the Agta in the Philippines, the women are the hunters and the men are foragers, and the roles are kind of flipped. This is true all the way around. Key piece here is no private property. Everything is public or commons, as they call it. Use rights. Groups have socially recognized priority to access specific resources. So instead of private property, what they had was use rights, and usually a band level group or a tribal level group, depending on whether or not how stationary they were, or sedentary, sorry, not sedimentary, I'm going into archaeology. Sedentary they are, ultimately you would have use rights, and you would have kind of a circle around your camp that was basically your hunting land. Then there was this is called the culture core. Around that's called the culture periphery. And in that area, you could still hunt, and it's also that you're probably going to run into a neighboring tribe or band in that group. Now, this is an important part of communication as well and trade. The periphery is where all the mixing and matching of genes and language and diffusion would happen. So this is important. Use rights is very different than private property. People would not sell off property. It had no kind of cash value. All right. Horticulture is sustainable in terms of a dependency. Is, again, we can kind of survive on little gardens and self-sufficient kind of styles. And it's going to emerge 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. So this is obviously the precursor into agriculture, and we'll talk about that when we get into ag. Gardens and hand tools are going to start to get a little bit more complicated or a little bit more defined for the actual job. Remember, look at function, right? If all I need is a stick to dig up a tuber, then why am I going to go waste a certain amount of time that I see as valuable, time that I could be swimming in the river, to go create some intricate tool that actually doesn't even work like it should. Now, with gardening, certain tools are going to become more of a necessity around being more efficient, and time becomes important. Remember, the idea of time through all of this is going to be an element throughout the semester. Foragers loved their time, and they basically had private time, right? It was their own time to be in their own heads, their own cultural time. We currently work on what we call work time, the 9 to 5 model where we wake up, we set an alarm, all of those things. Hunter-gatherers did not do that. For 250,000 years, human beings operated on the cycles of the earth and the sun and the moon. In horticulture, there's a transition again where you would still hunt. So hunting and fishing would still be an important piece here. You had your little gardens, but you would also kind of mix. This is, again, transition zone. Crop rotation or fallowing, basically leaving the ground fallow, was figured out pretty quickly because you'll basically suck all the important nutrients like nitrogen out of the soil. But it does create a dependence on weather and water. If you don't have those things around, it kind of creates problems. Now, what we can see is if we have a dependency on needing water for our gardens, what do we do if we don't get the rain that we need in order to feed our gardens? This is where we start to move into agriculture a bit and move towards the idea of, well, I'm just going to create my own creek or my own canal from the river to feed my gardens. Now we're moving into ag. Whereas foragers had what we called sacred land, hills and whatnot, foragers are more willing to move, so they were not as attached to the land as people who become more sedentary, like horticulturalists. Sacred land becomes more meaningful when ancestors work the land and ancestors are buried in the same location. Gender roles become more clearly defined. Women tended to do more of the gardening, and men kind of were tasked with the hunting. Some of the early ones were manioc and cassava, and we get a lot of garden crops early on. Figs are probably one of the first fruits that are domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. What happens is that families start to claim land, but they don't own it yet. So there's a claiming of, this is my territory. And what we're getting to is a couple things always to keep in mind. Time, function, and then we get into control and power. Now, the two types of power that we discuss in anthropology are power over and the power to do. And what you're going to see when I describe foraging to agriculture is a transition from power to do to power over, or control over, or control to do. Really, the idea of power to do is that if I wanted to feed myself, I could actually go gather acorns. This is the power to do. It's based on talent. This is how we get our jobs kind of mutually assigned to us in band or tribal level societies. And what we move from is the power over. So I have the power to do in an egalitarian society. I have the power to help the group. I do not have power over anyone, and I don't have power over nature. I worship nature. When we move into power over, horticulture is that first step. Now I have power over the environment to a certain degree. I can grow my own food. I don't need the earth to provide. I can do it myself. What it also leads into is power over land. So now we're getting into claiming of land, which is also going to move towards power over other people. Because we're going to move into pastoralism, which is power over animals, is not a hard transition to move into power over people. So pastoralism, sustainable, dependent on land use and weather. Again, this is pastoralism and horticulture are both dependent. Foraging, there is no dependency. The dependency is mobility, right? If I'm able to move to another location, as long as there's water on this planet, I'm going to find food and I will survive, right? That is the dependency there. Pastoralism starts soon kind of after horticulture. So again, we're looking at kind of 10,000 BCE, a little bit further back maybe, and really we get the domestication of goats and sheep. Herding domesticated animals, you must trade to have a balanced diet. This is the key piece. A lot of pastoralists are really, they're married to animal husbandry. And what I mean by that is that they are dedicating all of their time to feeding the animals, that it's very, very hard for them to forage or grow food crops on their own because they're nomadic and they're moving around. So they must trade for vital nutrients, a lot of vitamins and things like that are not found in meat or animal products. They are typically nomadic, so they move around. Family-based unit becomes very, very important. Bloodlines become very, very important because with pastoralism, what we get is ownership of animals. We have the first form of ownership with pastoralism. And this is a commodity or a material ownership process, whereas before we don't have that. Men are responsible for moving the animals, basically tending. Women are responsible for processing the animals, butchering and all of that other stuff that goes along with it, tanning the hides, all that stuff. So again, we get division of labor. So we've moved from no division of labor, no specific gender roles, to gender roles, ownership of animals, ownership of something, claiming of land. Land becomes more necessary, and we're moving from basically power to do into power over. Pastoralists have power over animals, right? And ultimately, if they have ownership of animals, they're going to have power over others depending on their wealth and their ability to feed people. Agriculture, it's not really sustainable. In a lot of ways, I mean, people nowadays are starting to move into sustainable agriculture. This becomes tough. You kind of need a lot of land to rotate the right crops, cover crops. We are getting more sciencey. It is possible. Science is helping us in this way. Ingenuity and invention in this category are helping. I put not really sustainable because what it does do is it leads to population explosion and growth. So we will eventually run out of arable land, which we can actually farm. So agriculture is growing crops on a permanent basis, permanent plots, intensive strategy. Remember, we talked about extensive, which is large areas that we have to cover. This is intensive, and agriculture is very intensive. Family farming is the first to pop up. This also matches up really well with the number of children that are born. A lot of times people think that a lot of kids were born, a lot of deaths early on, hunter-gatherer cultures, not true. 2 to 3 kids were the norm. When we get agriculture, we get up more towards like 7. And this is because they're family farms. Men do most of the farm work, women do the domestic duties. This is where we're really getting into gender roles, and even in America, this is a holdover from this time period. The 1950s and 60s were a holdover from this time period or a return to. Private property becomes a real thing, ownership of property. Laws are now instituted because we need to protect private property and people's ownership. It requires much more labor inputs, technology, and non-renewable resources. Things like water, sucking water out of the ground, aquifers that's not returning as fast as it needs to. Not necessarily positive for the environment. We get a lot of erosion. We get things like malaria. A lot of these things are going to come out of this. Wealthy landowners make out the best. The workers in the fields and growing the food don't. They get paid the least amount in most cultures. And because this has a lot to do with status. We get the progression of status. Egalitarian foragers, hunter-gatherers, no status. At least everybody's status is equal. In this structure, we have a hierarchy of status. And what we have is now we've completed the power over people or others or over the environment completely. There is complete power over, and the power to do is ultimately to achieve the power over.